So we ought to be terrified of change which is leading to loss of ice. And we shouldn't, we're not. We've become very complacent about the Arctic and about the Antarctic. And suddenly it's all coming to a head. And we're going to be in a terrible mess very shortly.
Hello, and welcome to the Climate Emergency Forum. I'm Herb Simmons, and I often will say when I introduce our programs that we have a special program, and we do have special programs almost every week. But this is an extra special program because we're focusing on the life and times of a remarkable scientist, explorer, and human being, Peter Wadhams, and his wife, Maria Pia Casarini. And we're going to dive into your extraordinarily amazing life because you are one of the world's most distinguished polar scientists. For over 5 decades, Peter has been a towering figure in polar research, blending the rigor of a leading scientist with the daring spirit of an explorer. His groundbreaking contributions have illuminated the mysteries of the Arctic and the Antarctic, from the ice caps to the depths beneath them, as we will hear. Professor Wadhams was formerly head of the Scott Polar Research Institute and full professor of ocean physics at Cambridge University, and he's led dozens of expeditions to the polar regions. His work has unraveled the remarkable properties of snow and ice, revealing the delicate ecosystems they sustain and the critical role they play in our planet's climate system. As the author of the acclaimed book, A Farewell to Ice, he has sounded an urgent alarm about the accelerating loss of polar ice and its profound implications for each and every one of us, whether we're anywhere near the poles or not. Few have contributed as much to our understanding of the Arctic and Antarctic as has Peter. His fearless explorations on the ice, beneath it, and across it have not only advanced science, but it's also, I think this is really important, Peter, you've inspired global conversations about the climate emergency that we face today. And you have been on this channel before any number of times to talk about that and have gotten among the greatest number of viewers we've had. So join us, viewers, as we explore Peter's remarkable career, his insights into the polar regions, and his urgent call to action in the face of a rapidly changing climate and planet. And he will be joined by his wife, Maria Pia Casarini, who's been the president of the Society of Women Geographers, on the executive committee of the Polar Educators International, and has also been on multiple polar expeditions. So welcome, husband and wife and explorer scientists. We're so happy to have you here. And of course, we'll be joined as always by Paul Beckwith and Peter Carter, our regulars, who I know are eager to start engaging in this conversation that will certainly look at the science, but primarily it's about your life, your adventures, your views, your perspectives. So I'm going to take my privilege as the host to ask the first question to you, Peter Wadhams, and that is, let's take you back to the year 2007. And as I understand it, you are on the submarine, the HMS Tireless, and correct me if I'm incorrect. You were in the Beaufort Sea as part of a very lengthy expedition across the Arctic that started out, I believe, in Scotland. And all of a sudden, you heard this extraordinary boom and bang. If I'm correct, take it from there, Peter.
Well, yes, I mean, that was the nearest probably that I've come to death. I was on a submarine that decided that it was going to blow up. It's an enormous noise. It's a sort of reminiscent of the Titan, but luckily had a more positive outcome. It was a ship where some a simple part of the ship, which was the system that generated fresh water, had decided to blow up and spread poisonous gases throughout the submarine. When that sort of thing happens normally in a submarine, you know that you've had it. You know, if you can't have explosions going on inside submarines. It's the sort of thing that happens with Russian submarines when they're about to blow up. But this was a British submarine. I was very concerned, that is despairing. But in fact, in the end, we were able to clear away the fumes and have an attempt to get things going a bit and carrying on. Two people were killed in that expedition. That was both the last submarine expedition I've been on and the last one that the Royal Navy did to the Arctic. They'd been doing regular Arctic voyages until that date, but that was the end of it.
Hmm. Well, what I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, in reading about this in your book, A Farewell to Ice, is I believe you said something like when it first happened, you felt this extraordinary peace and calm, that rather than feeling panicky or anything like that, you were, I think you may have even said you didn't think your pulse went up or anything like that. Is that an accurate recollection of mine? And if so, tell us more about that. That certainly seems like not something one would expect at a time like that.
No, I was surprised that I wasn't panicking, but for some reason I wasn't, and I just let things happen and assumed that it would turn out for the best, which it fortunately did.
As you said, two people did die, so it was truly a tragedy. And to the degree to which it may, as you're suggesting, may have made at least the British government wary of sending subs under the Arctic, after that, it may have had some, important and not very positive consequences. With that, let me introduce Paul Beckwith. Paul, as you know from watching our program, is a climate systems scientist from Ottawa and has taught at universities in the Ottawa area, has an extraordinarily popular and productive YouTube program on every aspect of the climate crisis. Paul, and I know you know Peter well, and the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Herb, and thank you, of course, Peter, for your decades of work. I've really sort of got into climate change in a big way around 25 years ago. And of course, you were one of the first people whose work I followed at the time. So I'm sure the 2007 accident was one of the most memorable trips you had up to the Arctic under the ice. But I'm guessing over your lifetime, would it be true to say that the Hudson 70 expedition was a turning point in your life? Because at that point, I believe you had just your bachelor's degree. And then you went on a cruise for, I believe, 11 months to the South Atlantic, Antarctica, this, South America, and many parts of global oceans. And after that trip, I believe you started your PhD work at Cambridge. So maybe can you tell us some recollections that you have on that trip? I mean, was that really a turning point in your life to get involved and do the PhD in science and study Arctic sea ice and dynamics of ice? Because, climate wasn't on the radar back then, right? Climate change wasn't on the radar so much. What do you recall about that expedition? And was that really a turning point? Would you say that's your most memorable trip?
It was, yes, it was certainly, it changed my life and it changed the lives of some of my friends who were on it as well. This is something which hits you when you're spending a year sailing around the world. It's not something that you do regularly. And in my case, I really have Canada to thank for that because they were starting a voyage around the Americas, and this was a big deal for Canada, a Canadian effort to understand the climate. The essence of it was sailing around, connecting up places where you weren't normally studying. One of them was we were working right around the Arctic. We worked in the South Atlantic, the South Pacific, in fact, everywhere where you've ever yearned to go, somebody was offering to pay for me to do it. So I was just
Right.
deeply grateful to Canada for
Mm.
have the opportunity to take part in that expedition. And it affected, of course, a lot of other people as well.
And I think, is it fair to say you came back after that trip and you started almost right away at Cambridge in the PhD program? And I noticed that, you went on your first British submarines like a year within a year of you starting the program. So did you make connections on that trip with the British Navy, or did they, with your experience with oceans around the world, invaluable to the Navy, and they thought we got to get this guy on our submarine? Because I believe you were measuring thickness of ice using upward looking sonar, and you were looking at oil spills for some of the British companies underneath the ice and things like that. Like, it seems like your career progression just kind of took off after that trip, and you got contacts with, the Navy, with oil companies, etc. They all saw the value of your work at that point. Is that fair to say that?
True, things took off that, and the expedition, the Hudson 70 expedition, was a wonderful thing. It was a format that was set out. You did it and you enjoyed it, and you came back again at the end. Being very grateful to Canada for having set up such an expedition, and that was done by Bedford Institute in Halifax. But as soon as I got back, I started to do my PhD, and there the bets were off really, because you desperately tried to find some opportunity to do measurements that would give you your PhD, and we had a lot of support from the Navy, mainly because the director of the Scott Polar Institute was an ex-submariner, and he was able to get me onto a submarine through the old submariners network. Things went on from there because nobody normally was able to get onto submarines. So this was a unique opportunity to really go and do some measurements that you couldn't normally do.
Right. And I guess these measurements were also invaluable to the Navy. I mean, this is during the Cold War, right? And a lot of Russian submarines are going under the ice. So to learn about the ice dynamics, where the submarine can break through the ice and surface, all of these sort of things are probably their interest in having you studying the ice and, them getting your results, etc., to use for strategical and tactical purposes during the Cold War.
So there was a military aspect to it, and I didn't mind that.
My last question would be, what year would you say you kind of started thinking of the idea of, climate change is occurring. It's going to become it's going to be a problem moving forward, because at that point there was some view things were maybe cooling a bit. Climate change was certainly not on the picture. I mean, it was with James Hansen's talk to Congress in '88. But, in the early '70s, it wasn't in the picture. So do you have a definite recollection of when you thought, my God, climate change is going to be a huge problem?
Well, I think it was cumulative. It started from the Hudson 70 voyage because we were doing so many different parts of the world and studying them, and you tend to get overwhelmed by nature, and it was something that then overwhelmed you, and from then on you were working with the realization that the world was changing dramatically. And so we sort of jumped from icebreakers to submarines, but it was a smooth transition as far as looking at the world and what it was doing.
Right. And I guess the submarines, I mean, now it's mostly autonomous underwater vehicles that would go under the ice. I can see moving to newer technologies and not having it necessary for scientists to go on submarines and go underneath the ice anymore. If it can all be done, remotely with underwater drones and things like that. So anyway, yeah, thank you.
I'd started actually in the early 1980s to do this, try to make a change. It was partly because of not being able to go on submarines anymore. The feeling that one could do a lot more exploration of the world with unmanned vehicles than you could with submarines. And so the AUV has been the vehicle of choice for me since then.
We want to now introduce Dr. Peter Carter. Peter is, as you know, a retired medical doctor from the West Coast of Canada, and you are the founder of the Climate Emergency Institute. You've been an IPCC expert reviewer, and I know the two Peters have known each other for quite a while, and I'm sure you're eager to start your conversation, the two Peters. So, Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Herb, and thank you, Paul. I'm so glad to see that you're looking so well, and I know you're still very active in Arctic science. I remember that the media gave you a lot of attention because you led a scientist team, who slogged across the ice, something which, with all the models and satellites, people tended not to do. And you actually had a great big screwdriver type thing. You bore through the ice to see how thick the ice was. And there was a very good reason for that, because Canadian icebreakers had recently said that whereas they had some trouble breaking through the ice over the past few years, no trouble at all. The ice is really very poor and thin. I think that was 2010. Can you remember it, Peter? I'm sure you can.
Well, it was about then. It was 2000 and something. And working in the ice with ice cores was a very, very important development. Being able to feel that this is a material where we're actually starting to get at what is happening with it, what's causing changes. That's all something that's only happened in the last few years.
I noticed that this year sea ice is tracking a record low. It's tracking 2012 all-time record low. And I'm sure you've been following the sea ice for many, many years. So I wonder whether you could give us some more insight into that.
Well, yes, the first voyage I did on a submarine was an example of just this change going on, because we went into the Arctic one year, then we did an identical track around the Arctic on the following year. So that was meant that we were able to see the changes that were occurring, and we found that they were quite extraordinary degree of change that was associated with the warming of the Arctic, and the fact that the material that was going into the ice was less than was coming out of it, so to speak. We could see the reduction of the ice cover in a single year. That was the reason, and that sort of, for some reason, attracted the attention of Mrs. Thatcher. I'm not quite sure why, but we did, and I gave a talk at the UN, in fact, on this. It was a very great help to science to know that our efforts were not in vain. I mean, mostly these days, your efforts are ignored, or they're treated like, especially anything involving the US, you're treated as if you were some kind of evil force. Here was a case where Thatcher miraculously, because she was trained as a scientist, was able to go for this and make a big deal out of it. And that's been the case ever since, really. Britain's been a kind of leader because the country has had Thatcher in taking a personal interest in it. So whatever else one may think about Thatcher, I think she owed her a debt.
Thanks, Peter. And I hope the UN had any sense at all, they would invite you to come and tell them what is real and what is happening right now, today in 2025, and issue the kind of call for action that you so eloquently and strongly articulate in your book, particularly in the last couple of chapters or so. But I think we all agree that science is an iterative process. It's trial and error. We make theories and we make projections and predictions and we learn from them if they're right or wrong. And let me ask you about one of yours that I had heard about. One of the first things actually I'd heard about you, which is that in your book, you basically said that, correct me if I'm wrong, that you were, I don't have an exact quote, essentially pretty darn certain that summer sea ice, I see you're smiling, would be gone by 2020. And while summer sea ice continues its inexorable decline, it's still around. Can you tell us a little bit about, what your thinking was in making that absolute a statement and what kind of response you got to it?
Well, it's a lesson in not extrapolating from data. And we were working with all the data points, new data points coming out of the climate data that we were developing, and it was dramatic. It was a dramatic change. Dramatically, the area of ice was decreasing, and so if you extrapolate that, you get to some complete loss of ice within a few years. And so I felt I ought to be giving a warning about that. But in fact, the loss of ice slowed down and it's still there. I mean, we know there is still ice in the Arctic. And if we'd have followed the extrapolation correctly, then there wouldn't be any. So that's in itself an interesting problem of why has the rate of loss decreased, and will it continue to decrease, or and what's going to happen? So I think so. One needs to be bold in making assertions, but not too bold.
I mean, the climate system can always throw curveballs at you. So let's talk about the curveball with Antarctica, because 2015 sea ice dropped off a cliff there, right? And you can also look at the ocean current systems, the AMOC, right? I mean, if the AMOC, it's been slowing down, if it shut off, then the Arctic would actually go into a cooling period, and then Antarctica warming would accelerate, right? So there's lots of these curveballs. You've studied, it's not just sea ice, you're an oceanographer, by training. And, if I look at your PhD students at the topics, I mean, it's all about dynamics of sea ice modeling, ocean ice wave interactions, landfast ice versus sea ice and decline. I mean, I find when I'm looking at somebody's work, looking at the titles of their PhD students' topics is one of the best ways to figure out, where you're thinking, because you are very influential to your PhD students, and they're also very influential to you and your thinking. So that really surprised people, right? The collapse of Antarctic sea ice in 2015. So can you talk a little bit about the overall system, how you see it changing now, and if you were bold enough to make some sort of prediction in the future? I mean, it's very possible we lose all the Antarctic sea ice before Arctic sea ice, for example. So can you talk about the system dynamics a little bit?
Yes. Well, of course, I daren't make predictions anymore.
No, well, nature's gonna do what it wants and prove
Just
you wrong, right? But we can try. We all want to try to make predictions or speculations, but we reserve the right to be wrong. I think that's important, right?
well, I think it's gone the other way. The change and the warming and has accelerated. That means the loss of ice is accelerating, and that's having massive effects on sea levels globally. There's really terrible things going on. We should be aware of those, and we should be aware that with the system, both the sea ice system in the Arctic and in the Antarctic, we're dealing with something very, very dangerously unstable,
Mhm.
which could easily lead to major collapses, which would look to us as gigantic flooding events. But it's really some disintegration of a component of the Arctic and our Antarctic systems. So we ought to be terrified of change which is leading to loss of ice. And we shouldn't, we're not. We've become very complacent about the Arctic and about the Antarctic. And suddenly it's all coming to a head. And we're going to be in a terrible mess very shortly. And so the people who have been concerned about the Arctic and Antarctic, there's some of the colleagues here are getting weary of trying to give out this warning that we have to do something, and we're not doing it, but we're going to suffer for not doing it. We're really going to be in a bad way. So we need to keep giving out those warnings and before they actually take effect and the world is collapsing.
Right. And maybe you could just elaborate on, okay, so one of the mechanisms for huge warming at the poles is the loss of the ice, loss of the sea ice. Another mechanism that's also very, very important is the loss of snow cover, for example, in the spring in the Arctic. So we're talking about a real darkening of the polar region and therefore more sunlight absorption, more heating, accelerated sort of feedbacks of warming, disrupting then the heat transport in both the oceans and the atmosphere, the oceans being the AMOC, the atmosphere being the jet streams, slowing, becoming wavier. All these things are tied together. And then another very strong, powerful feedback is methane, methane, as you say in Britain, and that coming out from the Arctic. So maybe just talk a little bit about the methane risk, and then maybe Herb and the other Peter can. I'm sure they have more questions too.
Well, methane, first of all, it came about that methane was being studied. Initially, the people one needs to give credit to is a Russian couple who were studying this when nobody else was, and so suddenly you're aware that methane is becoming a major element in the climate system, and it started to get dire when we were getting these methane explosions from explosive masses of methane release. And suddenly the amount of methane in the atmosphere was increasing faster than we were accepting as being the way things ought to be. So suddenly it became an element in the climate system. And that was new and was largely, I think, due to this initial stimulation that was given by this Russian group. That means that suddenly methane becomes a major element in the global climate system. And we from here on, you can't play with methane anymore. You can't pretend that it's just an amusing element. It's a major element, in fact.
Yes, methane, methane, methane. I thought Canadians also pronounced it methane, but I guess you're more like Americans in some respects, I guess. Yeah, I mean, methane is one of those areas that is so controversial, and you talk about that in your book, the sort of the methane burst of 50 gigatons that has been postulated as a possibility and downplayed by mainstream scientists. And of course, getting back to what we talked about before about making projections or predictions that may turn out to be false or alarmist or whatever. Nobody knows, right? And the best people and the best, hopefully, from the best motives and the purest motives, can disagree because there's so much about the system that is yet to be discovered or analyzed. And of course, in reading your book, there are so many areas where you were personally involved in new discoveries because of the decades you worked on this and your work as both a scientist and explorer, as an administrator, and so forth. So if the 1970 Peter Wadhams came back here today, and of course you are here today, and sort of looking back from that era over more than 50 years, putting aside climate change for a minute and how fast that's occurred, and how and the consequences that we've all talked about many times. What one or two things have most surprised you in terms of what you have learned and discovered about how the ecosystems in the Arctic and the Antarctic and in the seas, a lifetime study of yours. What most surprised you that you would have never anticipated back in 1970 or maybe 1980?
There's very little that doesn't surprise me. In fact, one of the things is as I said, methane, and the fact that that's suddenly is a major component of the climate system, while that hadn't been predicted. There's the speed. I think that what's happening now is very surprising. It's the speed at which the system is falling apart. We're dealing with material which is coming apart at the seams, in a sense that we're looking at losses of extreme losses of ice from various parts of the global system, which result in flooding, changes in sea level. We're suddenly seeing things combining together to give us nasty outcomes, and we don't seem to be able to deal with those. We're trying to keep too many balls in the air at the same time, and people who are studying the system are finding there are too many things to it that we can't deal with, and I don't know how that's going to work out, and I suspect it'll be disastrous in some way, but I don't know which way yet.
What you're saying is the word that jumps out at me, not the sexiest word around, is systems. And Paul is a climate system scientist. And the key is that these, just as you say, these are complex, incredibly complex systems. And we're still learning about many of the dimensions. I mean, you write in your book about some of the feedbacks in the Arctic that I think there's one chapter where you have 6 or 7 different feedbacks, not even including methane. That's a whole separate other chapter,
Yes.
and how they all interact with each other. And of course, the Arctic or the Antarctic what happens there doesn't stay there anyway. So then you have the whole planetary impacts. I want to ask you though, do you think, I mean, because in addition to being a scientist, we've talked about that, just skimming the surface today, of course, and an explorer, but you've also been an educator for decades. So as an educator, do you feel, at least from your vantage point at Cambridge and other places, that the educational structure and system that exists right now is fit for purpose, if you will? It teaches people in a systemic way to look at these variables. Is it too specialized? What are your observations? Because you must have been a mentor and teacher to, literally generations of explorers and scientists that are, all over the planet today.
Well, thanks for the compliment, but a lot of it is feeling that you're bashing your head against a brick wall, which is not entirely pleasant way of living. But we're seeing change which is far more rapid than we've ever had before. And we don't understand why this is going on so fast and why everything is accelerating. And yet it is. And given the rate of acceleration, we're going to be into extremely unpleasant situations very, very, very soon. The next decade is going to be a decade, I think, of disaster. At the end of this decade, we're going to be in a much worse position than we think that we are now. And what do we do about that? And so teaching is trying to understand how rapidly things are changing and be able to give a reason for that, and be able to look at rapidity of climate change in overall terms of what's going on everywhere. There's no simple solution, and there's no simple way to explain everything, and that's explaining difficult concepts is hard. I've always tried to do that in my teaching, to get explanations for phenomena. But the trouble is that things are changing too rapidly, and some of the changes are inexplicable. When you're doing that, you tend to lose the thread. So I think that's a lot of scientists are in that state. Help. What's going to come next? What do we do? That's the state we're all in.
Yeah, no, that's well put. How do you teach something when what you're teaching today is out of date or irrelevant or contradicted by some physical phenomena that occurs 2 years later or 5 years later? All the models are literally just models, whether it's looking historically or through computer simulations. They're all attempts at anticipating what hasn't happened. So by definition, they're crude and they're provisional. And yet we have to make decisions. We have to, as scientists, you have to go, or I'm sure you've been asked, as you talked about with Margaret Thatcher from time to time, to give advice directly or indirectly to the people who make policy. They want clear answers. They don't want to hear, in most cases, well, we're not sure, or we need 10 more years of study, or it's 50-50. So as much as it's easy to bash the policymakers, and it's certainly appropriate in most cases, on the other hand, we're dealing with a fiendishly complex problem. Before I turn it back to Peter Carter, I just wanted to see if your partner, Maria Pia, would like to join us and say a few words. Maybe you want to correct something Peter has said or modify it or expand on it. The floor is yours. Welcome to the Climate Emergency Forum. I've heard a lot about you, and I'm delighted to see you here.
Thank you very much. Well, we shared 52 years together with Peter. So I come from a completely different background, modern languages, Italian literature. I come from Milan, never been to the ice. And when I met Peter, he was some kind of figure out of this world, really, especially honestly, because, well, apart from the fact somebody that has scientist written as a profession on a passport was already giving these impressionable Italian girls really amazed, was creature coming from God knows where. And of course, when I met Peter was 1973, so he had only been on the Hudson until, that was very fresh in his mind. And amazingly enough, just the last weekend, the friend from Canada, from Calgary, with whom he shared a cabin on the Hudson, came to Cambridge.
Oh my.
And it was amazing. And and I'm very friendly with his wife too, who was already on the scene when he was on the Hudson. And we both realized that these two young men, Peter was actually spent his 22nd birthday on Moria. I was in Milan, he was in near Tahiti anyway, and his friend as well. They had this mind-blowing experience when they were so young, and somehow nothing else in life matched that.
Mm.
And in a weird way, they both have been somewhat slightly dissatisfied with their lives. It's been really interesting to actually, compare it with a wife with another person that had the same experience. And and then, of course, Peter had an amazing career with 56 expeditions. I mean, when people say, oh, you've been together, 50 odd years, I say, yes, but consider how many months we spent separate. I mean, 7 weeks on the submarine was normal. It was an absolute nightmare for me because there would be absolutely no news whatsoever because they were military things, although there was the only civil, he and a student of his were the only two British civilians that had space, they had the security clearance. but there was no way. In fact, you started with a bang. In fact, the bang of the accident of 2007. And I can tell you that it was so lucky that Peter, using the satellite phone, had actually phoned me in Cambridge just before he was on the submarine. They came up near an ice camp organized by the University of Washington. And then he actually phoned me saying, we are going to zigzag with the submarine underneath this ice camp so that we can match the data of people that are observing surface level and what's underneath. And then the submarine was actually going to let Peter to spend 3 more weeks on this ice camp. And when he phoned me, I just said, well, okay, good luck, see you next time. And and it was only about, and it was going to be like 12 days. And he phoned me after about 5 days. It was an afternoon. I was driving with actually a secretary of his, former secretary from New Zealand. He was really saying, there's been an accident. I'm okay. I am okay. I am okay. And I thought, okay, has there been casualties? And he said, yes, but we can't talk about it. And luckily, I knew that he was alive because about 3 hours later, it was 8 o'clock, the news on the British television, the BBC, and the opening thing was accident with casualties has happened under the Arctic. And, if I hadn't had that phone call, I could have probably, fainted or something. I had my relatives in Italy phoning me. That must be Peter. How is Peter? Because it was really frightening. And the one thing was, I was never, ever contacted by the Royal Navy. Not one word. So unless Peter had managed to phone me, thank goodness we had satellite phones, it would have been a terrible time for me as well.
Yes, well, the Navy kept a stiff upper lip, but these things are not infrequent. I mean, we think there are accidents that have happened to scientists as a sort of a kind of roll of honor of those who've lost their lives in, and that I'm thinking about. Yes, that his name was Konrad Steffen, and he was running a lab on the ice. He was monitoring the changes in the ice all the time, and so unfortunately, well, he basically fell into the sort of fermenting horror of the ice sheet. And he was a great person. He was a real. Everybody misses him enormously.
Maria, if you don't mind, while you're on, you're a past president of Polar Educators International, and you're president of the Society of Women Geographers and so on, even though your training is not in the sciences. I guess this is Peter's influence on you, some of these activities. But I mean, you're doing a lot in your own right. And I think your bio says you've been 8 times to the Arctic and twice to Antarctica, something like that.
Absolutely. I mean, I started actually helping Peter to analyze the data of the first submarine in 1976. Because when I came to live in Cambridge, I was teaching the guitar and classical guitar, but in the morning I was available. So we used actually a little ruler to measure the pressure ridges and these precious rolls that came from the submarine. And of course, we lived, slept, drank ice. Ice became in our lives, and I felt hugely privileged to be sharing Peter's life, actually. Yeah. I mean, my admiration is boundless, really. But but the point is that I knew all the scientists, I knew the science, I was doing proofreading of papers, I was very, very
Yeah.
much involved. And then in 85, there was this idea of the Germans, the German Institute, Alfred Wegener Institute, to go to the Antarctic in the Antarctic winter. And no ship had ever gone in the Weddell Sea since Shackleton's Endurance was crushed in the ice. And so I thought, okay, 3 months in the Antarctic winter, June to September, wonderful. What can I do to actually go on that expedition too? And, various things. I could entertain the troops and things, but that didn't go down very well. So, in fact, it was the director called Gottlieb Hempel who said, why don't you come on board and write a book? Because we want the non-scientist view of what's going on. He said, we want to give the taxpayers that are forking out a lot of money for this expedition. And they ask, what are these people doing and why? And you, as a non-scientist, could do it. So I actually wrote this book in German, came out unter Namen Polarstern, and I shared it with Dr. Bernard Stonehouse from the Scott Polar Research Institute, who went on board for the spring bloom. He was a biologist. So for me, that was, being thrown at the deep end. Never been to the Arctic, and I spent 3 months in the Antarctic winter. That was my baptism of fire or baptism of ice, if you like. And it was absolutely marvelous. It was the most, I could understand Peter and the Hudson much more after those 3 months in the Antarctic for myself. And then after that, because, I learned so much, you see, I was interviewing people all the time and spending nights where the people that were working at night, because the ship worked 24 hours. And I learned so much. It was unbelievable. Because of that, I then did the Master in Polar Studies at the University of Cambridge. And then it was, science. But and then I directed the Italian Polar Institute for 6 years in Italy. And then I joined Polar Educators International, and I'm still vice president, and I was president for a year. And this is really links with what you were asking about teachers and scientists, because we are doing a huge amount of understanding that we need the scientists to get the actual content of what's going on. But the scientists actually need us to be helped to communicate it properly and at whatever level. So we say, you can educate from our public is from 3 to 100. It's education is not teaching. And we're trying to get a lot of people from the Arctic, indigenous people as well, for our conference. We just had a big conference in Boulder, Colorado.
Here we are, the Climate Emergency Forum. The planetary climate emergency was widely recognized in 2018, 2019, that's a long time ago. Our governments are doing worse than nothing. Our governments continue to subsidize the fossil fuel industry and in increasing amounts. So my question is very simple. What do you think the governments should be told on climate, on Arctic, on the planet?
Dire warnings are needed in all the time. And it's like you're going off the edge of a cliff. You don't particularly want to go off the edge of the cliff, so you try to find every possible way not to go off the edge of a cliff.
Yeah.
And that's the way the world of science is. I mean, science has now got a huge responsibility for what is going on in the world and what do we do about it?
Yeah, so a couple quick things. Your bio says you published 5 books. So there was A Farewell to Ice in 2016 and then republished in 2017 by a different publisher. The other book is Ice in the Ocean in 2000. So
That's this one.
yeah, so you published 328 papers, peer-reviewed papers and so on. So, it's just an incredible body of work. So my question is, what motivates you to continue your work? I mean, you could retire quite comfortably, get the lawn chair out on the porch, and not worry about world news and climate. But no, you continue on. So I'm guessing one of the things that motivates you and keeps you young at heart is everything is a surprise to you. You made that statement. And I think that's a key statement for maintaining any interest in science as you get older? Because as we get older, we change our views, we change our outlook, and many people just want to retire and enjoy the good life. But many people don't, like yourself. The fact, I think, that you say everything surprises you, even after a career in science, a career in the Arctic and Antarctic and ice, and a career in the science world, you're still striving to learn more and to educate people. So would you say that, I mean, I could be wrong, but I think that's a factor that really keeps you young at heart and keeps you motivated to continue your working. So is that the advice? Like, what advice would you give to a young scientist who is just starting out in the field to stay motivated and have a productive lifetime, given the dire forecasts and things that we're seeing in climate, particularly?
Well, that's absolutely the case. And you should do as many different things as possible. For instance, I've spent a while in Italy with the Turin Polytechnic, and one of the things there that we were able to do, which surprised me, was that we found that you could study the chemicals that are associated with microplastics, basically. That if you look at all the microplastics and what they're doing, first of all, the things are dire. The changes that we're inflicting on ourselves are incredibly disastrous. But it's also the fact that material is spread around on the surface of the planet and is causing some of the changes that are happening in climate. You're doing two things at once. You're messing up the planet, messing up your world, and at the same time, you're adding to the disastrous changes that are happening on the material. So there's suddenly that we should be studying. Luckily, I was able to study plastics and at the same time the surfaces of glaciers where you've had glaciers bathed in microplastics. So suddenly that's something that you can do, and really exciting.
There's always new things coming along. I mean, I know that you're talking about the microplastics, and there's of course the nanoplastics or even smaller plastic chunks, and they can go through cell walls and get into organisms, including us, like our brains and tissues and so on. And that problem occurs because the longevity of the plastic material in the environment, over long periods of time, it can be mechanically broken down into smaller and smaller particles. So, it seems like there's some obvious solutions to reduce this problem, like, have biodegradable plastics that don't last very long, and then they don't have time to be broken down into these micro and nano plastics and so on. So I guess, but getting back to the motivation, I guess it's, I think it's the curiosity. We never really grew up, Peter, scientists. We were curious as kids, and that has stuck with us. And I think if that sticks with a person through their life, they're always going to be interested and motivated to learn more and more. We care about our home, the planet. And it is very frustrating, like in today's day and age, with the attacks on science. It makes us really wonder, what's coming next. I guess. I don't know. But anyway, yeah, I mean, you've done obviously some amazing work over time. And I've come across the idea of these nanoplastics. There was a paper arguing that the human brain maybe has up to 0.5% of nanoplastics by weight. That number has increased 50% between 2024 and 2016. If that study, it's one study only, but if that study is correct, it's going to be very, very concerning for, moving forward, because in patients suffering from dementia, the levels of plastic in their brain are much higher than the median, which I said was 0.5%, or the equivalent of 7 grams, which is the equivalent of a plastic, the plastic utensils, a plastic fork, a plastic spoon. So imagine that in your brain, it's just mind-boggling to me. Hopefully the study's wrong. But yeah, I mean, this curiosity, anyway, we're talking about motivation, really. The curiosity is a huge factor, I think. So whatever you're doing it correct, and many other people can use you as an example for their own work.
Following up on what Paul just said about curiosity. So I'm curious. We've been talking this entire time about what you have been doing, going back to the Hudson and thereabouts. So if we were going to have a follow-up chat in a few years, hopefully, well, of course, we'll do it more frequently than that. But if we were here in 2028 or so, and we said, Peter, what have you been up to since 2025? What might that be? What are you working on now? What would you like to work on? Or are you just sort of sitting back and enjoying life with Maria Pia? Not that there's anything wrong with that.
Well, I wish I could enjoy life, but unfortunately, the situation in the world doesn't permit it. And think about what's going to be coming up. Then this microplastics and how they interact with humans is something that I think is extremely dangerous. I mean, we might end up having not being able to do anything because our brains are so addled with the effects of microplastics. If they're affecting the entire planet and everybody on it, then it's sort of like a science fiction horror story where suddenly everything is changing and we're not able to cope because our brains are not able to work properly anymore.
You're working on that now, Peter? That's what I'm really asking. Is this something you're actively involved in or would like to be more involved in?
Yes, I'm working on that and I would like to be more involved with it, yes.
So Peter, as we all know, the Conference of the Parties, the big annual COP meetings that are coming up on the 30th of them in Belém, Brazil, in just a couple months, are kind of a spectacle. And I understand you've been to a number of the COPs. Can you give us your observations and your experiences there and whether you felt they were of value?
I was very impressed by the COP held in Glasgow, but then they seemed to deteriorate from then on, especially fossil fuel industry blatantly took over. And it was sort of blatant, the only word for it, and you're not going to get any progress that way.
Assuming climate continues to accelerate and we head towards global food shortages and things like that, I understand that your views are that we really need to try to cool the planet if possible, or at least we need to capture carbon, and at least look at the possibility of solar radiation management or solar reflection methods. So I think on your bio it says that you're for research on these things. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, yes, because I think for some reason there's a kind of thing against trying to bring about climate change. Some of the people doing it thinks that you must prevent any further research to be done, which is just ludicrous. You must prevent research, absolutely. And how on earth that can be justified, I don't know. But you've got to deal with those characters, and unfortunately, there seems to be a number of them coming out of the woodwork.
Yes, it is paradoxical that what many of us think is maybe the only or certainly the most likely intervention that may actually be able to stabilize and ultimately reduce temperatures is the sort of open scientific inquiry about everything else doesn't seem to apply to that. And one more paradox in the climate crisis that we all deal with. As part of wrapping up, I also wanted to quote from the end of your book. And of course, the book is A Farewell to Ice. And we highly recommend you purchase it from your library or ask Peter for a copy of his book or whatever.
The American edition has got all the plates in it, so buy American.
But before we end with Buy American, I just wanted to quote the last sentence or two about how you sort of wrap up what again is an extraordinary book because it's science, it's a story, it's some of your personal experiences. It tells you so much in such a wonderful manner about ice, about oceans, about climate, about cold. And it says, as Chief Seattle put it eloquently more than a century ago, quote, all things are connected. Whatever befalls the earth befalls the children of the earth. If we destroy our planet, we destroy ourselves. This is Peter speaking, not the chief. If we destroy our planet, we destroy ourselves. There is nowhere else for us to go. There is no planet B. It will not just be farewell to ice, but farewell to life. So, with that, I hope those of you who are watching will take that to mind, get involved, learn about the Arctic. There are many, many groups that are active in helping to protect and save the Arctic and the Antarctic, and ice everywhere and glaciers everywhere. It's a worldwide problem, and we urge you to get involved, to stay involved. I want to just thank you all for, we've had a remarkable conversation today. Can you bring Maria Pia back on the screen so we can thank you as well? And your perspective, not surprisingly, maybe is equally valuable and provocative. And it's fascinating the way your two careers have reinforced each other. And I know I speak for Peter Carter and Paul and Charles and Heidi in expressing our enormous gratitude for you and all the your kindness to us at the Climate Emergency Forum, the programs you've been on. But more important than that, of course, is your contribution to the people of this planet, decade by decade, year after year, book by book, expedition by expedition, paper by paper, 300 and whatever it's been, and counting. That's priceless. And I know we're all not in the best of moods about what we're seeing around us, but we'd be in a lot worse shape if it wasn't for people like Maria, Pia, and Peter. And so with that, thank you to everybody. We will, if you like this program, then please give us a like and recommend this to your friends and your colleagues. Subscribe to our channel. Leave us some comments, suggestions for future programs, and we will see you all next time. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you.